get started tonight. And first, let's say welcome to the program tonight. It is called Passionate Patriotism, Women in the Revolutionary War. And it's a perfect time to have this program since the 4th of July is coming, and women often didn't get recognized for what they did to help ensure our independence. So I think you'll be very interested that I'm going to show you tonight where several ladies help make our independence happen the way it did and deserve to be recognized. So let's see if we can get started with the show here. And okay, first of all, as I say, it's called Passion and Patriotism, Women and the Revolutionary War. And much of our early history was generally written by men, about men. However, women played a large but often unmentioned role. During the Revolution, women were raising money through female-run organizations. They were refusing to buy British-made goods and products. They passed messages. They were spying, scouting, and even fighting. And they all had one thing in common, and that was patriotic passion. At the very least, they took care of the home front to put food on the table, because during this time period, we did not have a government in America other than the British. And so we had no money. So if the women weren't home doing some work and taking care of things, the men had no livelihood to come back to. So as I talk about the women tonight, I'm going to divide them into groupings about where they made their most contribution. And we'll first start with those who made their most contribution politically, because that's what got kind of instigated the movement to gain our independence. And first, let's start with Abigail Adams. She is a woman who many of you have heard her name. And let's talk about her contribution to starting this force. So here is Abigail. And in 1775, Abigail, along with Mercy Warren and the governor's wife, Hannah Winthrop, they were appointed to the Massachusetts Colony General Court to question fellow Massachusetts women who were charged either by their own word or actions of remaining loyal to the British Crown and working against the independent movement. So Abigail was with a group of ladies who were trying to ferret out the traitors within their colony so they wouldn't tell the British and making the movement for independence that much more difficult. John wrote to Abigail, John Adams, who eventually became our second president. He wrote to her and he says, "You are now a politician and elected to the important office of Judges of Tory Ladies." Well, also what Abigail did. Abigail remained in Braintree, Massachusetts, managing the farm and household. Women did not normally handle business affairs, but she traded livestock, hired help, bought land, oversaw construction, supervised planting and harvesting, and this allowed her husband to become the statesman and leading advocate for American independence. If you know what was going on here, Abigail was staying home in Braintree, Massachusetts, while John was off in Philadelphia helping to draft the Declaration of Independence. Throughout her career, Abigail often served as an unofficial advisor to John. And one of the things she advised him is, "I desire you would remember the ladies." What she was trying to do is, as our independence was being written, she was trying to get freedom and equality for women written into the document, and feeling that women make as equal a contribution as the men. And we're going to see that here as we talk about the women tonight. Another woman was Mercy Otis Warren. If you remember the names Otis and Warren, both of them, those families were very active in the movement for independence. Mercy's brother was an Otis and her husband was a Warren. She is often known as the conscience of the American Revolution. She was an influential writer and the first woman playwright in America, and she also wrote poetry. And what she did was she wrote political poetry and drama, trying to convince the colonists that if they really wanted to have independence, they had to do more than just complain about it. They really had to make an active move toward pursuing it. And that's what she wrote in her works. Now, one of my favorite women is Sarah Bradley Fulton. Um, You've probably heard of the Sons of Liberty. We even have a movie about them, but there was also a Daughters of Liberty, and Sarah was one of those. She is also known as the mother of the Boston Tea Party. Now, I think you all know about the Boston. There's Mercy Warren, and you can see what she did. And then here is Sarah Bradley Fulton, the mother of the Boston Tea Party. And here's the Tea Party, and what Mercy was known for is she came up with the idea that the men should dress as Mohawk Indians, and you can see the Mohawks here on the ship, and they're throwing the tea into the harbor. So Sarah came up with the idea, and she and her sister-in-law helped dress the men as the Mohawks, and then they went out and threw the tea into the harbor. And when they came back, they helped put them back into being respectable Bostonians. And here they're putting the makeup on them. And that's how the Tea Party happened. She also was active in the revolution itself during the Battle of Bunker Hill. Though when the wounded were brought into town, there was actually no hospitals. Most of the people just took their sick to the doctor themselves. So when here come all these wounded, there was a space near Wade's Tavern, and she and a lot of women acted as nurses. There weren't many surgeons, so these women acted as nurses. And it was even said that she removed a bullet or mini ball from a man's cheek. So she actually did some surgery. Also, she passed messages. The mayor of her town of Medford, she actually lived in Medford rather than Boston, asked her husband if he would deliver dispatches from Washington behind enemy lines. And for whatever reason, he was unable to do that. So Sarah delivered the messages, and she went behind the enemy lines, and she came back safely. Now we're going to talk about another aspect of the revolution which needs attention. Remember, I said that we did not have a government, therefore we in America could not collect taxes, and therefore we had no money to finance our war. Well, the soldiers need fed and clothed at the very least, and I think they'd like paid, but there was not much way to do that. But various wealthy people like John Hancock did a lot of the financing of the weaponry and so forth. But enter Esther Deborah Reed, she helped in another aspect. Esther was born in London, so you might have expected that she would have been on the other side, the side of the British, but she married a John Reed who was going to law school in England, and they came back to America and lived in Philadelphia, and she became a member sort of the high society there. Well, while she was doing that, she and her husband entertained notables, including Washington himself, and she learned that the Continental Army, the men were hungry and in need of good warm clothing, and she decided she would help. So she gathered other like-minded political women, and they went door to door in Philadelphia collecting money. They managed to get $300,000. Now today that would barely buy a good house, but also today that $300,000 is worth $9,134,000 and some change. So it actually was quite a lot. And she asked Washington, what should she do? And he said, take that money and buy linen cloth and make shirts for the men. So that's what she did. And she and her group made over 2,000 shirts. Also in this picture, you will see this sentiments of the American woman. She wrote a broadsheet, which is the equivalent of a front page of a newspaper, about the size of a legal sheet of paper. And what this did was it was her trying to convince other women that they should do like she did in their towns, organize something to help give material support to the men who are trying to gain our independence. Sadly, Esther didn't live very long. She died in 1780, but her work was carried on by Sarah Bache Franklin, who was Benjamin Franklin's daughter. And as I said, they ended up making over 2,200 shirts for the Continental Army. Now let's go to another area of where women contributed: couriers, scouts, and spies. It's one of the more exciting areas, and women were very effective in here because of the stereotypes of women, that they were weak, feeble, not too educated, easily frightened. And because those images were what portrayed the typical woman, women could get away a little bit less observed in some of these activities. Now, I know you've all heard of Paul Revere from the Henry Wadsworth Longfellow poem, "Listen, my children, and you shall hear the midnight ride of Paul Revere." And when I was a kid, I kind of thought Paul Revere did it all. But to tell the truth, there were a lot of messengers. And one of them was this teenage girl named Sybil Ludington. Sybil Ludington has been celebrated as the female Paul Revere because of her ride through Putnam and Dutchess counties, this is in New York, to warn the militia that the British troops were burning Danbury, Connecticut, which was just across the border, approximately 25 miles from her home. Sybil's father, Colonel Henry Ludington, was a commander of the Dutchess County militia. And why he was called upon, British General Tryon arrived in Connecticut, and his men set about burning stores and houses in Danbury. So he was basically destroying the town. He arrived on April 25th, 1777. On the evening of April 26th, so just one day later, a messenger had been sent out from Danbury to go find Ludington and ask him if he would come help run the British out of town. Ludington would obviously be willing to help, but his men were farmers and they were out getting their fields ready. Think about this, this is April, you begin your planting in generally May. So he had to round up his men. The messenger arrived in the evening and he's exhausted and he doesn't know the area. Colonel Ludington says, well, I'll be glad to help you, but I need to gather my men and I need to stay here on the farm so I can tell them what to do. Well, his 16-year-old daughter was there and she volunteered to rouse the militia. She rode out at 9 p.m., so this is a night ride, on the start of a 40-mile circuit, and she knocked on farm doors and she shouted that the British were in Danbury. Each of the men she woke gathered also other militiamen living nearby, and they headed for the Ludington farm, and the colonel was waiting to get them organized. And Sybil rode through the night, though, waking dozens of her father's men, and she had to avoid bandits and British sympathizers on her route. But she did manage to gather the men. They did march to Danbury, and they had to march. They didn't get a bus. They had to march 25 miles. They got there, and they obviously were late to stop the burning. The British had a almost a 2-day lead on them, but they did manage to drive the British out of Danbury and back to Long Island Sound. Another woman who did similar kind of work was Lydia Dara. Let's see, there's Sybil on her path. You can see today it's a pretty area. Here's Lydia Dara. She was an undercover spy and patriot. George Washington maintained a large spy network, including a number of agents in British-occupied Philadelphia. At first, Philadelphia was in our hands, but then the British finally took it over. So Lydia is still there. And Lydia is a Quaker woman. A lot of people believe that Quakers did not involve themselves in war efforts, but that is not true. They involved themselves in various aspects, and Lydia is helping here. One of the best generals in Washington's army was Nathaniel Greene, and he was Quaker. We'll talk about another lady here tonight who was Quaker. And my own ancestors fought in the Revolution, and one was killed by a Tory, but they were also Quaker at that time. Well, the British were in Philadelphia, and they met in Lydia's home. Now, I told people the other night about the Quartering Act. The British had a most odious act that said that the colonists were supposed to give the British quarters because there weren't motels. The most there were little boarding houses. Now, when they meant quarters in the original writing, they meant things like vacant stables, vacant churches, or unoccupied. But the British, seeing nice houses and stuff, leaned on the people like, oh, you got a nice house, you got room for us, take us in and feed us. And the colonists were somewhat afraid to say, no, we won't. We don't really want you in the first place. So there were British basically staying and meeting in Lydia's house. Well, Lydia hid in a closet in an adjoining room to where they were holding their meeting. And she heard little tidbits about what their plans were. And she'd scuttle that information off to her son, who was working, he was in the Revolutionary Forces. Well, she saved thousands of lives that way, including perhaps Washington, because one day in December, she overheard the British saying they were going to make a surprise attack on Washington, who was camping in a town called White Marsh, just outside Philadelphia. Well, Lydia used the excuse that she was going to go get flour at a mill just outside of the city limits. You had to get a pass because British controlled who came and went. So she got her pass and she went outside the city limits and directly to the Patriots and told them what the British plans were. Well, they were ready for the British when they came, and Washington and his colonists ran the British right back into Philadelphia. Another one we'll talk about tonight is Agent 355, Hidden Daughter of the Revolution. So let's see her. Here she is. They show her very seductively on this book cover, but we don't really know much about her. We don't even know her name. But she was a member of the Culper spy ring, and I will talk about that later. I like to see if we can get my picture up here. And maybe you can see I have this book, The Secret Six, which talks about the spy ring. And she was known to be perhaps a member or a maid in a high-placed loyalist family. It is true that a lot of the families were divided on whose side they should be on. So she was probably someone who agreed with colonists, but was somehow still living with a loyalist family. And this family apparently had access to some of the high-ranking British officers. Well, one of them was John Andre, who was almost like the head of British intelligence. And somehow Agent 355 got wind of a conspiracy where our General Benedict Arnold was going to turn over our um, uh, West Point to the British. He was going to become traitor. And so she passed off that information. And we were somewhat waiting for the transaction to happen. We were going to try to obviously get both Andre and Benedict Arnold at the same time. Well, we did manage to catch Andre. The fort was saved, it never got turned over to the British, but our Benedict Arnold went over to the British. He'd already made arrangements to make the escape. He went over to the British. So while our fort was saved, one thing that perhaps happened out of this is since Arnold was captured by the British and now he doesn't have a fort to hand over to him, it is guessed that he handed over several Patriot spies, including giving the name of 355 to the British. She was captured and held on a British prison ship where we believe she eventually died. So we do not even know her name. I'll talk a little bit later about the British prison ships. Another spy we'll talk about was very interesting. We'll move right on here. Patience Wright. Patience, again, was another Quaker. Her husband died, and the inheritance laws at that time were not very favorable to women. She was able to stay in her home, but she wasn't able to inherit any other property. So now to support herself, she began sculpting in wax. Her sister also was widowed and joined her in this sculpturing. And they had waxworks houses in Manhattan and Philadelphia. She was so good, Jane Meekum, who was Benjamin Franklin's sister, encouraged her to go to England. And so she went to England, and she became quickly popular with the British high society, even meeting King George and Queen Charlotte. And while she was around with sort of the high society of England, she was able to pick up little bits of sensitive information, and she sent them back encased in her wax sculptures. Now, later on, the British began to suspect that she was maybe not a good one to talk to, that good information might be leaking out. So she kind of got pushed out of the inner circle. But for a while, she was there and was able to get information. The next one I want to talk about, if you remember no name from tonight, remember this lady, Catherine Moore Barry. This is probably why we won the Revolutionary War, and you rarely hear anything about the women, but she is known as the heroine of the Battle of Cowpens. And she spent most of her time as sort of a scout or spy, but she was involved across the board. Where she was very helpful, she knew all of the roads and paths around her plantation. And so she knew all the shortcuts, and she was an excellent horsewoman. Barry is best known for her bravery and warning that the British troops were coming, and she got her friends and neighbors and General Daniel Morgan all warned that these British were coming. What is told in the story is that when she heard the news, she tied her toddler to a bedpost while she rode out to warn everybody. Winning this battle ultimately led to the removal of General Cornwallis, who was really one of Britain's better generals, out of South Carolina. And this ultimately led to the turn of the war to give us the favor, once we're starting to push them back now, we started winning, and this was the beginning of the end of the revolution, so to speak. When she told Morgan, and I don't know if you remember the name Daniel Morgan, but our Morgan Township, right south of us, where there is Okeana, that is, and Shandon, Okeana and Shandon are there. That is named for Daniel Morgan. He was one of the best generals on our side in the revolution. And they said he had one of the most strategically innovative maneuvers to capture this cowpens. So if it were not for Kate Berry's ride and her warning people, we might not have turned the war at this point. Now, people do ask, do women actually fight in the war? And the answer again to that is yes. Prudence Cumming Wright was a minute woman. And what is her story is she lived in Pepperell, Massachusetts. And when she learned of the Boston Tea Party, she and the women of Pepperell burnt their tea on the town square in sympathy. That's how she got started. But it gets better. When the men of Pepperell left town to become a militia, that left the women and the children and the elderly and the infirm behind with no defense. Because when the war took up in these areas, almost many of the small towns were practically drained of any male of fighting age, from the old to even almost children who were able, they wanted to go. So that left the women behind. Well, the women decided to form a militia of their own. And the women wore their husbands' clothing, and they carried weapons ranging from muskets to farm tools. The militia formed because Prudence overheard her brother and his friend, who were on the other side or sided with them, saying they were going to ferry documents and information from Canada, where the British had a home base, to Boston. So the women waited at the only bridge that they had to cross on the Pepperell River, and they grabbed these two men and they confiscated their documents and they held them prisoner, and they forwarded the documents to the Committee of Safety, and the men were exiled forevermore. So you see, women were involved and they did what they had to do. And there's the bridge in Pepperell that they had to cross. And you can see the women were ready to fight, and dressed as men. You couldn't tell until you were up close who was men and who was women, and that's what they were counting on. Here's one of the more famous ones, Margaret Cochrane Corbin. She was a camp follower. A camp follower was generally the wife or sister, or sometimes the mother of some of the soldiers, and sometimes they even brought their kids. But what they did is they did the basic domestic work for the military. They cooked, they did their laundry, sometimes nursing. And that's what got Margaret there with the men. Margaret, on November 16th, 1776, this is early in the war, she and her husband and all of them, they were stationed at Fort Washington. The fort was attacked by British and Hessian troops. Hessians were Germans. They were reputed to be very good, ferocious fighters. Margaret's husband, John, was assisting a gunner who was killed during battle. And then John took over the gunner's position. We're talking about cannons here. You see them in the picture. And it took more than one person generally to get a cannon fired. One loaded the ball and one set the fuse. And you had to ram the ball down into the barrel. And you also sometimes had to swap the barrel out after it fired. So there was a lot of work to firing a cannon. But then her husband, John, eventually got killed. Well, that left Molly alone with the cannon. Well, she'd been watching him loading it and doing some help. So she took over firing the cannon, and she was reputed to be a pretty good shot. But even then, she eventually got wounded, injuring her shoulder and her jaw, and she never did recover um, use of her left arm. Um, Sadly, though, Fort Washington was lost to the British. We didn't lose so many killed in battle, but they took a lot of prisoners, around 2,000 of them, and many of those prisoners died in poor conditions after the war. Even Margaret was taken as a prisoner. They eventually let her go to an invalid hospital. She was one of the few women who actually received a stipend for her service. She got half an active duty soldier's pay, so figuring women were only worth half as much, but at least that's something. So she and only one other woman actually got paid for military service. We're going to talk about that other woman. Her name was Deborah Sampson, and she was actually a full soldier until she was found out. Deborah Sampson became a hero of the American Revolution when she disguised herself as a man and joined the Patriot forces. She was the only woman to earn a full military pension for her participation in the Revolutionary War. You would have thought she'd be one of the least likely people to end up in a war like this. She was born in Massachusetts, one of 7 children of Jonathan Sampson and Deborah Bradford Sampson. Both were descendants of preeminent pilgrims. Jonathan, her father, was related to Miles Standish and Priscilla Alden, if you go back to your colonial history. And her mother was the great granddaughter of Massachusetts Governor William Bradford. But still, the Sampsons struggled. And the reason why they struggled back then, even if you were sort of a prominent citizen, even a governor, you still had to work. You did not necessarily get paid as a governor. You might have had ships, been a merchant, and sat at home in your governor's mansion seeing people, but you had ships out making you money. Well, the case with the Sampsons, her father was lost at sea, and that left a widowed mother with 7 children. And back in the day, unless you had other family that could assist you, you farmed your children out to others. And that's what happened here. Deborah was only 10 years old when she got farmed out to be an indentured servant for another family. And she was a servant till she was 18. And then she was self-taught, and then she became a teacher for a short while. And she did weaving part of the time to make money. But she was very patriotic. So in 1782, the Revolutionary War was still raging. Sampson disguised herself as a man, and she called herself Robert Shirtliff, and she joined the 4th Massachusetts Regiment at West Point, and she was assigned to Captain George Webb's Company of Light Infantry. She was sent on the dangerous task of scouting neutral territory to assess British buildup of men and materials, because Washington was thinking he might have to attack in this area, and he wanted to know the strength of the British. In June that year, Sampson and 2 sergeants led about 30 infantrymen on an expedition that ended with hand-to-hand combat. She also led a raid on a Tory home that resulted in the capture of 15 men. At the siege of Yorktown, which is one of our final battles, she dug trenches and she helped storm a redoubt, and she endured cannon fire. All during this time, she was not found out. She made sure that she actually got a slash in the forehead with a sword, and she got shot in the thigh, and she removed the bullet herself so she wouldn't have to get medical attention and be found out. When she did get found out, they were in Philadelphia, and she caught up an epidemic, and someone took her to the hospital, and then she was found out. She was discharged, but she did get her pay and eventually was able to get her pension. So let's see, there's Deborah Sampson. Let's go back. You can see Margaret Corbin was injured, and this tells about her. Um, I'll tell you a little bit more about some of these later if we have time. But here's Deborah Sampson. There she is as a soldier dressed, but that's probably when she was found out and asked to hand in her resignation. She did get married, lived to age 66, and her husband tried to draw her pension, which they actually gave it to him, but he died before he could collect it. Here is one feisty, fearless frontier woman. You've got to remember her for the fun of it. Nancy Hart was imposing red-headed woman who they said was about 6 feet tall. She maybe was related to Daniel Boone. We're not sure about that, but she's living in Georgia at the beginning of at this time in the war. She was a very skilled herbalist, hunter, a good shot, even though she was said to be cross-eyed. She married late in life. She was 36 when she got married, but she still went on to have 8 children, 6 sons and 2 daughters. But during the Revolution, while her husband was away, she managed their farm, and she often snuck off to spy on the British. She dressed as a man, and because she was tall, she would probably look like a man. She pretended to be feeble-minded, and she gained information then that she handed off to the Patriots. She was also believed to have fought in a battle at Kettle Creek. The British sort of knew, or thought they knew of her leanings, so they were often spying on her. And one day her daughter saw a Tory peeking through the cracks of their cabin. And she tells her mom, there's someone looking through the hole in the cabin. Well, her mom was in there making soap. And if you know anything about lye soap, it can burn you. So she was boiling the soap down, and she took a ladle full of this soap and she threw it through the hole where the guy was spying on her, and she scalded him. And he and her daughter, or she and her daughter, went around and tied up the spy and turned him over to the Patriots. But the most famous story about her was involved 6 British soldiers who came to her house looking for a Whig man who they thought had passed through there. A Whig is like a political party. Well, he apparently did pass through there, but Nancy wasn't going to tell them. So they killed her prized turkey, her last turkey, and demanded that she cook it for them. Well, they sat around and waited, maybe to see if the guy showed up again. Well, while she was doing that, she had a plan. She was going to get him drunk on her corn liquor. And she sent her daughter off to get water. And she said, hey, while you're out there, blow the conch shell and alert our neighbors that the British are here. And so the daughter did that. Mama's cooking the turkey, feeding the guys liquor. And then while they're busy eating and drinking the liquor, they had stacked their muskets in the corner of the room. She's slipping the muskets out through a hole in the wall, and the daughter's out there getting them. Well, alas, one of the soldiers sees what she's doing, and he jumps up to try to stop her. She pulls the gun that she has in hand around and aims it at him, and she says, don't move or I'll shoot. Well, he didn't think she'd do it, and he moved, and she killed him just right off, and she shot another one too, and they surrendered. Well, it wasn't long till her husband and the neighbors showed up, and they were going to just shoot the rest of them. And she says, no, hang them. And so the neighbors and all hung all 6 of those soldiers. And as proof of that, in around 1912 on the property, that they owned, they discovered 6 graves all neatly in a row, and they do believe those were the 6 soldiers. Now, another area that I will talk about, I mentioned the prison ships, and that's where the Agent 355 is believed to have died. Well, the prison ships were a pretty sad place. We didn't have much for prisons early in the time because if you were bad, oftentimes if it was just mild badness, you'd be put in a stockade and have tomatoes and eggs thrown at you, or you might be horsewhipped. And if you were real bad, they'd just take you out and hang you and be done with it. So they didn't have much for prison cells. So now comes a bunch of prisoners of war. What do you do with them that's secure and you don't have to spend a lot of your men watching over them? Well, what they often did was they put them in ships in the harbor. Often those ships were not seaworthy. They were leaky, cold, damp, but they could then scoot that out a little bit to sea, and it was hard to get off of them, and they could set just a couple men watching all these people. Well, enter Elizabeth Bergen. She helps the prisoners escape. At first, it is said that maybe she was just taking food to them because they didn't have much food, and the British weren't concerned about feeding them. They were the enemy, and the British were having trouble getting enough food for themselves. So it said that she was taking food to the prisoners. It could have been on the ships, or it could have been in a place called the Sugar House, which was sort of a sugar building within a city. But at any rate, the less you knew about spies and things like this, the better. So there's not a lot written. But at any rate, someone from the Culper spy ring, which I showed you the book, he met up with her and he said, hey, would you help me help some of them escape? And his name was George Higday. And she was taking messages to them and helping set up escapes. It is believed she helped over 200 men escape off these prison ships. Well, the sad thing was a letter got intercepted, not from Higday himself, but from somebody who mentioned Higday's name. And of course, the British came and arrested him. And in order to try to save him, Higday's wife told on Elizabeth Bergen. Well, now there's a price put on her head of 200 pounds, which is about $26,000 today, or a couple of years of soldiers' pay at that time. So there's a lot of people out looking for her. Well, her friends help her escape. And at first, she goes to New Jersey, then to Connecticut, and then they help get her back to Philadelphia. Problem is, because it's so dangerous for her, she's escaping without her 3 children. She's believed to be a widow. She has 3 children. So eventually, the Board of War helps get a flag of truce to get the children to her. Now she's in Philadelphia. She's doesn't have a thing but the clothes on her back, basically, and she's got her children, but she had to leave everything behind to escape. Friends did help her, but she petitioned Washington. He offered her a pension and support for her kids, but eventually she said, no, I don't want to be taking this and being troublesome and expensive. And she asked him, would he get her cloth so she could sew shirts and make a living? She did eventually get enough money. It was $53 and 1/3 of a dollar. I don't know how you figure that per year. And so I guess that's what she subsisted on till the end of the war. And there you can see the prison ships. You can see that they are very sparse. They were cold. In the winter, the men had nothing but the clothes they came with. So if they only had a shirt on, they were in a drafty, cold ship. Many of them died. We lost more soldiers to disease and things like this. There was smallpox and the like than we did to the actual shooting in battle scenario. One last area I'll say a few words on were the nurses. This is the typical area where you would have expected women. But early on in the war, the nurses were men. And that was because they felt soldiering wasn't a place for women. And they thought they'd go out in the battle and the men could handle it. But it took, for every 10 people injured, it took one nurse. And eventually, Major General Horatio Gates wrote to Washington and said, men are suffering from the lack of women's nursing care. And so Washington kind of said, let's get some women in here. And they offered them $2 a month. Well, nursing was not a glamorous position because following the camps around, you could get smallpox or camp fevers, and it was one of the dirtiest jobs. It was very hard to get nurses. Eventually, they raised the pay to $8 per month for a nurse. Now, when you consider that surgeons and apothecaries were paid $40 a month, you can see the difference. But one person who doesn't get enough credit other than who she was married to was Martha Washington, the wife of President George Washington. But before he was president, she followed him around, and let's read a little bit on her. She doesn't get remembered enough in her own right, but in Valley Forge, the soldiers were shouting, "No bread, no soldier." They were starving. Martha Washington arrives on the scene with supplies from Mount Vernon to help feed them and get clothing. She set up a sewing circle with other officers' wives, Kitty Green, wife of Nathaniel Greene, and Lucy Knox, wife of Henry Knox, both generals. And these women left their children at home so they could join their husbands. Martha traveled every winter to the quarters with her husband. She emerged as a selfless, courageous, patriotic woman. And one witness wrote of Martha's activities, "I've never in my life knew a woman so busy from early morning until late at night as was Lady Washington, providing comfort for the sick soldiers." So she did a lot to help do nursing. And as I say, it was a very unpleasant job. One other that I'll just mention, Abigail Corbin Peck, she also did some nursing. If you remember when we talked about Danbury and Sybil Ludington, Abigail Corbin Peck was in Danbury. Her husband was off fighting the war. She was left behind when it was burned. I guess she managed to have part of her home. Many of the places were burned down, but she took the men injured, the wounded into her home and nursed them back to health. She lived to age 101. So very interesting lady. Now I'm going to stop my slideshow. And I wanted to show you a couple things I missed as I went through our presentation. When I was talking about Lydia Dara, one of the things she did was she hid her messages in button covers and in needle books. And I don't know, I'm going to try to show this. Buttons in the past came in two parts. Let's get this in front of the camera. And so if you can see around the edge here, there's a top and a bottom to this button. And some of them are completely cloth. Here's one that was cloth. And the cloth stuck through on the back. That's how they held them together. There's a cloth coming through on the back, and you can see sort of a metal area. And the cloth was pulled tight over that, and then the metal piece pushed in, and the little piece in the back was sewed to the clothes so it wouldn't come off. Well, in between the two layers, there's a small blank space. So she had to fold the messages up really small to fit in there. Also, you've all seen these needle packets. Your mother probably had them. They come in all shapes and sizes, but they often have layers to them so you can stick the pins in there. And she hid the needles in there. she hid the needles, the messages in behind the needles and things. So they had ingenious ways to pass their messages, because the British began to suspect that women were sewing them in their hems and things, the easy places. So you had to find harder places to put them. Now I'm going to open up the chat if anybody has any questions. And the other thing you can do, if you push down on your space bar, you can talk and you can just actually ask me the questions. Just hold the space bar while you're talking.
Hello, can you
Hi.
hear?
Please go on.
Yes, right. I want to say thank you so much. It's very educational. A lot of material I had no idea. And I'm sorry there aren't more participants, but hey, that's their loss. But I really appreciate this very much, not knowing too much about the Revolutionary War. So again, just many, many thanks. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. The program is recorded, so anybody who didn't make it tonight can actually pick up the recording. Probably it'll take a couple of, I'd say a good week or two to get posted, but I knew tonight might not be, if it's nice outside, people are outside.
Yes, and the music has started uptown too, so this is another draw. But
I
as
can
long as
see
it's
that.
yeah, as long as it's recorded, I mean, this is good for education later on for during the school year or anything. So I want to say thank you so much for this really entertaining topic. It's very, very instructive. Thank you.
You're welcome. Have a good day. Anybody else?
Well, I agree with Judith. I learned a lot, and I was born in Massachusetts because my dad was in the service. And so for me, I just always kind of felt like that's where I belonged, even though I grew up here. They brought me back because there were two really bad hurricanes. And so I've been in this area, but I've always wanted to go back and learn more about the New England area and the history. So this is great. I love it.
It's a good place to go, and there's a lot of good history in Boston, and there's a lot of good history in Philadelphia. So if you ever get a chance to go check out Revolutionary War history, those are two of your very, very best places to go. And as you can tell, I'm a Revolutionary War buff. Uh, it's one of my favorites. Before this, I didn't realize the contributions of the women, and I'm all for letting our contributions be known.
I agree.
So
Thank you very much.
you're welcome, and tell your friends they can see the program, and maybe sometime in the future, I'll be doing some other good program that you'll like.
I hope so.
And thank you for coming tonight. I really appreciate it.